The sermon today is about moving fences. Once there was an old reprobate who had lived a wild and loose life, much in love with gambling in the bottle. And when he died, the local minister, who was something of a tyrant, insisted that the man be buried outside the fence of the cemetery because the consecrated ground inside the fence was only for good and upstanding Christians. Now, years later, when the minister was long gone and the man's daughter came to the church to pay her respects, she looked and didn't find the man's grave outside the fence. So she went over to the old caretaker and she asked him, "What happened to my father's grave?" So the caretaker took the man's daughter to a grave that was inside the fence. And the woman was somewhat abrupt. "Why did you move my father's body?" The caretaker smiled and said, "We didn't move your father's body. We moved the fence." That's what Jesus is doing in today's gospel. The woman who came to Jesus is described as a Canaanite woman. And she fell outside of the boundaries of what any good Jew would consider acceptable. Among the ancient religious practices of the time, purity and impurity were easily defined. If you belonged to a certain religious group, you practiced your faith by obeying the religious laws that were set down. And then you were considered pure. If you were outside of the religious group and disobeyed the laws that were set down, you were impure. It was plain and simple, and the boundaries were set. Now, we can see the most radical example of that in the news every single day as we hear about this so-called Islamic State willing to exterminate anyone who doesn't agree with their way of seeing the faith. The woman in the story was outside of the boundaries. And Jesus, showing God's amazing grace, simply moved the boundaries. Moved the boundaries that had been set up, and he healed the woman's daughter. Now, the next story in our gospel, which isn't a part of our lesson for today, has Jesus going from there to another area. And he heals a man who is deaf and unable to speak. Now, you have to realize that this man was also beyond the boundaries of society. Language, after all, is the basic link between people. So those who cannot hear or speak are seriously marginalized in the rest of society. And by restoring this person's ability to speak, Jesus reintegrated him into society in the deepest possible sense. You see, there are no restrictions on God's grace. I believe that most people, most of us gathered right here today, can relate to being on the outside, experiencing some kind of rejection or another because of the tendency of human beings to draw lines, to say who is in and who is out, who is included and who is excluded, who is accepted and who isn't accepted. And we lay down the ground rules, maybe not written, but certainly understood, as to who gets accepted and who doesn't, who is one of us and who is not. There are barriers that are built up over time, where certain people are kept outside and they are unable to cross those barriers. Sometimes it's the poor. We keep them at a safe distance if they're not equal to us. Sometimes it's certain racial groups that are kept on the outside. Will we ever get beyond that white-black barrier that causes things like Ferguson to happen? Sometimes it's the mentally ill that are kept on the outside of the fence. The elderly, the young, those that are a little different, whatever, whomever we consider strange. We set up fences everywhere. Everywhere we look, there are fences. We have to remove the fences that keep certain people apart from others. And removing the fences begins when we begin to see everyone not as separate from us, but rather as one of us. A young man was trying to find the meaning of life. And so he asked the question of a wise old man that he had gone to visit. And he said, "When can I really say that it is daytime? when I see an animal off in the distance and I can tell whether it's a horse or a cow? The wise man said, no, surely not then. Is it when I see a tree and I can tell whether it's an ash or an oak? Not at all. Then I don't know what the answer is, said the young man. You'll have to tell me. And the old man said, it's when you look at a man's face and you see him immediately as your brother. And you look into a woman's face and you see her immediately as your sister. If you can't see that, then it is still night, no matter what the clock says. What does this all mean for us in this age? We have to start, just like a peoples of every age, and we have to take seriously into ourselves the golden rule. To do for others what we would have done for us, or stated negatively, to not do to others what we would have not done to ourselves. It starts with looking at all that is going on in the world, in our immediate vicinity, where people are exploited, where they're dealt with unfairly, where they're treated as less than human. We need to look into our families. We need to look into our relationships. We need to look into our workplaces of every kind. We need to look into the media, into the medical facilities, into the courtrooms, the community facilities, the politics, the civil rights, the schools, the churches, all of them. Are we able to change the way people are treated in those places and those arenas where we can have an influence? Can we advocate for justice? Can we act justly? What could be your particular contribution to those efforts? I know the task can be overwhelming, even for groups of people when they work together, and it can certainly be overwhelming for individuals who try to take on these kinds of problems. But there are some things that an individual can do. Remember the optimism of Confucian scholar Zunzis, and try to take it on yourself. Every man or woman on the street can be a force for good in the world. Maybe we need to start by deciding to reach out to at least one person who is experiencing life on the outside, separated from others, and not experiencing life to the fullest, and move the fence for that person. Tuesday, Jane Baker and I, who share a meeting together, she's the diaconal minister at Ascension Lutheran Church, we were lamenting over the news, the conflict in Gaza, the Islamic State in Iraq, all of those fences, literal and figurative, which separate those peoples, the situation in Sudan and Syria and the Ukraine, the children on our borders, Ferguson. How can we learn to act justly? How can we not be overwhelmed in the face of so much hatred, so much pain, so much bigotry, and so much violence? How can we interject an element of compassion, a voice of justice into any of these situations, let alone all of them? And I was confessing to Jane that it is just so tempting to just sort of hunker down and not think about it. So much easier to just go about my daily life and allow myself to be unaffected, untouched, and untouchable. Jane confessed that she had been feeling the same way. But then she had heard God speaking to her, telling her to do something that she can do, something within her sphere of influence. So what Jane has done is that she's applied to be a foster parent for one of these border children or one of these trafficked girls for whom she has such deep concern. Imagine that. To provide a temporary home for a marginalized, deeply troubled, frightened teenager. Now, Jane is 72, though you wouldn't know it to look at her. Jane is single, and she lives at home comfortably with her little dog, Snow. I was blown away by the idea that she might do this. Now, Jane may or may not succeed in having a profound impact on the life or the lives of these foster children, but she believes that it would be to her detriment if she does not try. She must move one fence in her life, make some small bit of difference within her sphere of influence. She cannot just hunker down and ride it out. Jesus is certainly an example and an inspiration to us when we see him in a short lifetime able to move fence after fence after fence. The fences that kept people apart in his day and gave many the opportunity to become fully alive, to become fully human in their daily lives. I mean, how often do we see Jesus dealing with this task just one person at a time? Certainly, look into today's gospel lesson. Jesus reaches out to one person who is called a Canaanite woman, separated by others, marginalized by society, and designated as not worthy to be one of God's children. If we can follow Jesus' way, if we can reach over the barriers, if we can move out of our comfort zones, if we can help someone, Jesus promises that our lives will be forever more full, more meaningful, and more abundantly joyful. We, each and every one of us, needs to move a fence.